Hi, I am William F. Bryant, and this is my podcast, Voped. It's been a little bit since I did one of these or wrote an article or anything like that. I'm not even sure how many people look at any of these things or even are able to understand them, but I don't do these to make money. I do these to try to inform people of the situation that they're in, because, fact be told, nobody learns anything about economics and finance in school unless you actually go into it. And even then, you're only taught really what you're needed to know to perpetuate the system that we're in, when the fact of the matter is that the situation that we're in is caused by the authorized illegality of the Federal Reserve central banking system. And the wars, the poverty, the redistribution of wealth to the upper 0.01% would never have ever been possible if we were not switched over to a deficit spending fiat currency system. If we would have stayed on an asset-backed system, everything would have been fine. And so that's kind of what I want to address today, because a lot of people don't understand the difference between an asset-backed currency or a fiat currency system. If you're born into something, you just tend to think it's normal and that's the way it works. One perfect recent example is the TSA, which was poofed into existence along with Homeland Security in 2001 with the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was jammed through Congress by an event that I will still believe was the typical government-caused reaction solution system to initiate a global surveillance system and enact quote-unquote laws to invade people's privacy and financial interactions, and prevent a lot of financial interactions and track financial interactions, whether or not you are actually criminal or not. The instances that we're facing right now actually branch off of that. This whole lockdown system, COVID bullshit, basically, is the secondary extension of that to prevent travel. Literally quarantine you in the places that you are at and only approve travel for those that are of the, shall we say, correct mindset. The credit scoring system will be alive and well here shortly, and this has already been it's actually been told to you several times over. No one really pays attention to it. The great reset of the economic forum and the whole vaccine system, the COVID thing, that's run by Gates, who's not even an MD, longtime eugenicist, kicked out of several countries for the vaccines that he tried to push. You can look all of this stuff up. I don't really much care if you do or you don't. Klaus Schwab, curiously enough, he pops up, but there's a 30-year gap in the history of where he's been, what he's done, what he believes, and who he is in general. You can, again, look that up. I don't really much care. But the fact be told is that most of these people, odds are, probably have deep roots to the old either socialist systems or communist systems of the families of World War II, and even stemming back to World War I. If you look at the history of those things, interestingly enough, most of them are banker wars and were started as such and financed as such, and once again could only have been done if you had a fiat currency system. So what is a fiat currency system? Basically, that's a a currency that's not backed by anything. Not having it backed by anything, it's just paper. It just has denominations put on that. It allows it to also have deficit spending then. Deficit spending is generally allowed because it's like a credit card for a country. You spend beyond what you make, and you're able to do that because somebody else, quote unquote, buys your debt for a given interest rate, which is what treasury bills are. Now, I know that might not make a lot of sense, so let's start from something very simple, and maybe the concept will come together. First off, government is, I don't really even want to say necessary evil. Government in general is pointless and useless, and actually originates from more of a power-hungry mafioso type stance. It doesn't matter whether you look at monarchies or you look at clans or you look at whatever. It's almost always been initiated and started by those who have the power to force other people under their will. Now, you can either do that by physical force or you can do that by money, and obviously money is a little much simpler to do that with. But ideally, say you start out, and we'll use a simple context, and you're going to have to use a little bit of imagination here if you're younger, because young people have never really had as much coddling as in this current generation. And I don't care if you whine about that, because it's a fact. If you had ever gone through the Dust Bowl or been around parents and stuff who literally saved strips of tinfoil because of the fact that you never knew if you were going to use that tinfoil again, then you'd understand actual hardships that people went through. But anyway, let's look at an agrarian society. So you've got we'll roll way back to just agricultural and farming things, and I always tend to use an excerpt of going back to where you've got riding on horseback, and you're using wood tools, and you're still using oxens, and you're rolling back to the 1300s or something, just because it simplifies everything, and it makes the context easier. But your entire goal is to grow crops. Maybe you're trying to grow enough to stockpile and make it through the winter, what have you, but your sustenance is grown off the land. At this point in time, no one controls you. You're fully and completely free, and that's really what freedom is. It's the freedom to make all of your own decisions, but you're also fully accountable for all your decisions. Nobody's going to come and bail you out. It's very much the battle with nature. You either are able to survive or you're not, and that's complete and total freedom. And people just simply don't understand that aspect. But that freedom also comes with the fact that other people might come along and try to take your productivity. You're growing and you're trying to put all your hard work into stuff, and maybe you've even taken time to gather the seeds to grow the crops and the plants that you're growing. And someone comes along because they perhaps don't have that ability, or else they just don't want to put that kind of work in. It brings in the context of the grasshoppers and the ants, if you've never heard that story. But perhaps this other person comes in with a group of people to steal your productivity, and they come in and take all your food, and you're left with nothing. That group does that to enough different people who are just trying to grow and survive and maybe can't defend themselves. And all of a sudden, the groups that couldn't defend themselves find out about this, and they begin to organize and try to form some kind of a protective unit to protect the goods and productivity that they've come up with. This just makes it more difficult for the people who come along to steal the stuff. But at some point in time, the people who steal the stuff, if they wipe out enough farmers, they find out, well, man, these people are actually growing stuff that we're taking. We don't want to take all of it. We just want to take stuff that we need, and then maybe we can take a little bit extra because we can bring it somewhere else to trade or something like that. But they're our cash cow. They're providing for us to survive, and we don't have to do this. So somewhere along the lines, these groups decide, you know what, maybe we can talk to these farmers who've kind of formed a coalition. We'll be their protectors, and we'll charge them protection fees, and be able to be kind of like a standing unit army while they do their crops and so on. And so they kind of sign off into this agreement. And this actually isn't really all that much different from what you see in a feudalist society or the monarchies of Europe or many other places. Now, it didn't always work like that. Sometimes your coalitions of farmers grew big enough that you had family clans or tribes and tribal systems. But the concept was still the same. People were still trying to grow, and then you'd have to have a defensive measure to protect it. And that therein lies the hitch of the need for some kind of organized entity to provide that safety, and perhaps even go beyond that to provide things like roadways or infrastructure that maybe might be necessary. Granted, if the tribal system is small enough, maybe you just need walls for protection or something like that, but usually you have to have some kind of decision maker to help organize resources and so on. And that's what you're looking at. So whether you hire somebody out or you organize a tribal system, you all of a sudden develop something where you have a centralized person who's holding sway over the power that's the protection of the village. Obviously, these people, they may or may not take part in the agriculture, but they definitely benefit from the fruits of that labor. And so therein, you kind of have your initial systems of formation of government. What happens, though, is that, like with everything, something about human beings, it's never good enough what you have. You always want to go and get more. And you find out something of value, and so you go to get more of it. Now, this doesn't matter if you're looking for, say, minerals and metals, lumber, something like that. Maybe you need those raw materials to make better weaponry. Maybe you want to make better fencing, better houses, better whatever. But you don't have it where you're at, so you have to venture on to go find something somewhere else. Well, if someone else is already there, then you end up having to attempt to take it from them. And if you manage to, then things grow and get bigger, and you have bigger cities, and you have definitely a feudal system at that point. But this is how things get bigger and expand. As things expand and you look to have marketplaces, perhaps you're tired of warring or it just is too far, the next step to bring things into your community is to venture off and attempt to trade. And that's kind of the next step. You take, and this is kind of a key concept because I always maintain that economics is based on demand. You take what you have, and if you demand it in your area, you're hoping somebody else demands it in some other area. And it's kind of that same concept. You take the resources that are available to you, and you'll bring them somewhere else. And for the most part, early on, that's probably what happened. If you have a lot of timber in your area, that's something you can trade. If you're, end up having a skill of some sort, maybe you're really successful at raising cattle or sheep, hogs, goats, whatever, same thing. You might attempt to either take those skills or something somewhere else as well, but you develop marketplaces, and you develop trade routes. The marketplaces, then you've got commerce going on in a bartering system, but the people who are in power want to take bits and pieces of whatever is going on, especially if they're your protector element, and that's where your first tariffs and taxes and systems like that develop from. So you've got marketplaces, and you've got your bartering systems going on. Now, bartering systems are kind of interesting. Like I said, you take whatever you've got in one place and you're hoping to be able to bring it and get it to another place. But how often and how well does that work? Take, for example, fish. You can't really bring fish somewhere unless you find a method to first salt it and then be able to distribute it. You also have other items you might have to do pickling or other methods of preservation, especially if you don't have the modern conveniences that we have, and in this instance you don't. This is kind of where things start off from. And so you might look to do something like, if you have fish, maybe you've got somebody nearby who does copper mining, so you swap it for copper, and that immediate swap, at least you get something for it. Then you can take the copper and then trade it for something else that you need, or just portions of whatever copper you need, and then trade the rest of it. And so you've got all kinds of these systems going on. The point being is that everything is goods for goods, everything is tangible, and you start to work out a valued system when you're bartering. And at this point, I just want to mention a little bit about the incorrectness of the labor theory of value, because as I had mentioned at some point in time, most of everything that is taught in economics is based or branched off of Ricardo's theories, and he came up with the labor theory of value. Ideally, the amount of labor that goes into something creates the value of it. This is where the whole Workers' Party system, the Communist Party, and Marx developed his theories from. But the fact of the matter is that labor theory of value was never true, because how much work you put into something doesn't dictate its value. You who make something do not get to dictate the value of that item. You've just expended those resources, which would be your time and perhaps tools or resources into making that, but that doesn't guarantee that it's going to have some kind of value. Value needs to come from, number one, scarcity, number two, desire, or usefulness. And so what actually happens is that you do kind of a comparative analysis, more mentally, but you're looking, and somebody else perhaps they're really great at making earthenware, and maybe you're really great at fishing, and you have to spend a lot of time to get a certain number of fish, and they have to spend their time doing the earthenware. But you look at that earthenware and you're like, well, that's pretty good, but I make a half-ass earthenware and it works. That one looks better and it would be kind of cool to have, but do I really need it? And how much do I need it? And so you're evaluating this, and it's the same thing in the other person's point of view. Maybe that village of earthenware, maybe they use their earthenware to do a lot of gathering of berries and seeds and things of that nature. And they're like, well, we have food. Fish would be nice, but it's not essential. How much, value does it really give me? How much benefit, how much happiness, and all that kind of stuff. And that's where your value and your pricing actually comes into play. And it's important to understand this, because the bartering system, regardless of whether we pay money now or not, that money still represents, even though it's a fiat currency, it still really represents a certain amount of labor. Now, loose credit and people's credit cards and so on, they distort that, because people view it like they have more money than they do, even though they owe actual additional interest on that money. And I'll address that in a little bit. But the concept still is that if you get paid $10 an hour and you're looking at buying something, and you'd really like to have, say it's some kind of a music player, or MP3, or a computer, or whatever. The fact is you're looking at that and, wow, it's $200. Is that a week's worth of pay? Does that take up half of my check? How does that play into it? And then you're really kind of calculating this out, because you're like, well, I have to work this many hours to make rent, and I have to do this many hours to do, I need this for gas, or this for insurance, or this for the bus fare, whatever it ends up being that you need. You already know how many hours you have to work to make that, and how many extra hours this is going to be. And so you're kind of already doing that comparative analysis in your head when you're looking at stuff that you buy. And so it's not all that much different. But like I said, the credit system, it skews that. But that credit system also kind of turns you into a slave to the system, because you actually have to do real work, real labor, to pay back something that somebody else just printed on a press. And I'll address that more, because that's a relation here. But Back to the bartering system, that's really where your value comes in on the goods that you're looking to buy. It has nothing to do with the amount of labor you put in. If you put in a bunch of labor into something that nobody wants, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much you try to sell that for, or if you justify, put in all of this amount of work. Well, everybody who doesn't want it's going to be like, well, you're an idiot. I don't want it. There's no market for it. Use it yourself. And that's the fact and truth of it. It has to be something that's desired and beneficial, some way. It gives some kind of a gratification, and that's where value is determined from. And then the other primary thing is that it has to be then something that's scarce. And not all scarce things have value, but valuable things are scarce typically. It might be a little bit different in today's pricing systems, but you have to look at kind of the origin of this and then begin from there. If you're only able to, if you really want one of those earthenware pots or vases, then they are only able to make a certain number of them. And so maybe somebody else wants one too, and you actually are going to get benefit of this. Somebody else comes along, wow, I could really use that to gather such and such, and that would be really, really helpful. I would trade this many items for that. I would trade this much lumber for that. That would be great. I could really make use of that. Somebody else comes along and they say, well, yeah, I could really use that too. Well, then you've got actual demand for something that's scarce going on. So only so many of those can be produced, and you've got multiple people wanting it. Well, then price goes up, and price is generally an indicator of value. And so that's where that whole thing starts off of. But in a barter system, it's very messy. It's tough to trade things for other things, which is why mediums come along of exchange, and that's the concept of money. Now, it could be spoons for all it really matters. It doesn't really matter what you trade for something else, as long as people both agree that whatever you're trading has some way of being retrieved for something they need and some value to it. Meaning, like, you can't, and it obviously your money can't be easily duplicated. It has to have an inherent scarcity as well. I mean, those are kind of basic concepts of money. It's got to be fungible. It's got to be easily transported. It's got to have value. It's a store of value. Can't lose value. Another reason why a lot of assets can't really be traded on things, like, for example, people talk about why gold was used. I think that, there are some other out there theories, but one of the primary things about gold is that, yes, it is scarce. It can't just be found anywhere. And so that gives it a usefulness, because you can't just find mounds of it and have somebody take over and purchase everything in an entire town because they found a huge supply of it. I mean, you do find, if you did discover a mine, sure, but a lot of work goes into pulling that stuff out. And so it's not something that's going to be readily available either. It does take capital to pull it out. And so that's an appealing factor of gold. But beyond that, gold is something that it doesn't go bad. And what I mean by that is there have been empires that have been built on salt. One of the reasons why is because salt is essential for life. People don't realize this because you're always told how bad salt is for you. But the fact of the matter is that if living things don't get salt, they will die. I mean, there's a reason why you have salt licks for cattle, or you put out salt licks for deer. You need salt. It's part of the functioning components of the body. And so empires were started up on salt mines, and salt was used as trade, and it was used as a medium for commerce. It probably was a little bit awkward, but because everybody needed it, they could find somewhere to trade that, or somebody would come to get it and they could trade stuff for it. And so salt was used. However, obviously with moisture, rains and so on, if you don't store it properly, salt goes, you can lose it. It's no different than if the fish goes bad, and food and commodities, agricultural commodities, they go bad. You could back something with a certain amount of grains. If you promise grains to somebody else, if they were to give you something, yeah, you could do that, but it's not a guaranteed it's not a guaranteed trade. You don't know for certain how many bushels of corn you're going to get. And the corn can go bad. You're not sure with that kind of stuff. Even if you go into other metals, the metals might have other usefulness, and plus they'll oxidize. For example, iron oxidizes. Copper oxidizes. As a byproduct, obviously they were much more useful as either tools or weapons and things of that nature, and so you could use them for that. And they're a bit more common than gold, but gold didn't have that same usefulness. Gold was extremely malleable. It wasn't really very good for weaponry, but it lasted forever. It doesn't go bad. It doesn't oxidize. You can store gold for long periods of time and not have any issues with it. And one of the things you do if you do have a medium of exchange is that you will accumulate that medium. It doesn't matter whether you think about it today and you accumulate cash or if you were accumulating gold. Granted, today we get to hold it as a digital number in a computer, but the concept's the same. Somebody would have had to hold it. If it was just pure paper, that paper would have gone bad, and that's why our dollars aren't actually made of just paper. They've got cloth, and so you can wash a dollar and it'll come out and you can dry it and it'll be fine. And so there's that concept of being able to have it last for a long period of time. Anyway, so it goes along, and you do need a medium of exchange. And so somewhere along the lines, rather than trading whatever it was that they were trading, they came along and started trading gold. And gold has a history of being the medium of exchange way back. I'm fairly certain that it was probably the what was this? Way back to the Sumerian. There we go. The Sumerian civilization, which I believe on their tablets they actually have market transactions that occurred and the amount of gold that was paid for something. And so it's been around for a long time as that medium. And so in the example now, instead of having to cart off fish for lumber or something of that sort, you're now able to trade gold for that. Well, fantastic. And of course, like I said, the people who are the strength and in charge, the people who are government, whether they came in and they took it as a fee, or you formed a tribe and you kind of set people aside to be that counselor or whatever, they at some point in time they always try to usurp a little bit more power from people. It's interesting. It's part of a human concept, I think. But they start to take little tidbits, and whether that's food or otherwise, it doesn't really matter, but little tidbits of gold, and eventually that turns into taxation. Some of it just comes from the fact that if you had an open, sprawling marketplace with a lot of available items and you were able to attract people to your marketplace, then if you had the strength to do so, then you could simply have your army, your guards, whomever, take a little bit from whatever was coming into the marketplace, your first forms of tariff, and make money from that, which is also how governments make some money, by the way. None of this stuff has really changed over hundreds and hundreds of years. But as you're a government and or you're supposed to protect people, or you're supposed to form some kind of infrastructure or commerce or whatever, you do have motivations to do these things. Because the safer your people feel, the more people who move there. And perhaps the more people who move there, then all of a sudden you start instituting taxation, which once again, of course, happens. If the people feel safer, then perhaps more people will come to market. If more people come to market, you need more roadway, more space. If you think of a farmer's market, you need space to put it and set it up. You can pay people to create wider roads or more space or flatten the land or make it more appealing. Perhaps if you're a port city, you want bigger docks, more to be able to take in more boats and more shipments. You need more to attract more people to be workers to unload these ships. I mean, you have incentives as a governmental entity to try to bring other people in, because fact is that if you do and you start implementing taxations or tariffs or something of that nature, the more people who come in, the more money you start collecting. It's great. Problem is that at some point in time, the people who are collecting this money, they always end up getting greedy. They want something that they've seen, and something always happens. They want to be idealistic, and that happened in Rome, and happened for Macedonia. It happened everywhere. It didn't really matter. Somebody has something that somebody wants, and they go and get it. Sometimes it might just simply be the fact that you need more gold to circulate, and somebody's got a gold mine, so you need to go out and get it. And that initially was, like I said, one of the few ways that you were able to bring in more money. You have two choices. You could find a gold mine and bring it in, or somebody else could go out and find a gold mine and bring it in. Or you need to bring more people in to trade products, or more people need to live in your area so you can take more money from them. Now, that should be pretty fairly evident. But if you actually have to go out and you find a mine, whether it's merchants go out and find it and start bringing it back or whatever, the fact is you're going to have to send people out to protect it, number one, or you're going to have to go send people out to shush it and take it over and then protect it, and then pay people to mine it and then bring it back. Now, as the government, you don't necessarily have to do that. If you have free enterprise, perhaps there's a merchant who would be willing to do so. But then usually the merchant works out some kind of a deal with the governmental entities. They could do private enterprise and hire security to go do it, or the government will go and send people to go do this. Now, this mechanism, when you actually are bringing this money in, this is where your price specie flow comes in. Now, Hume witnessed this, and this is an important thing too, because it doesn't matter whether you're talking about gold and assets, or if you're talking about a fiat currency system where you're printing the money. Whoever brings in the money, wherever it originates from, are the first to benefit from that money, because it hasn't actually gone through and filtered into the entire system. Now, what I mean by that is, say you're a merchant and you've actually gone out and you're investing your money to mine this gold, and you're going to bring it back. Well, you start bringing the money back, and you pay the bits to the government first, because they know you're bringing it in and you're going to be very wealthy from it. And you start spending that money. Well, you spend it at this booth and barter place, this store, this store, and you start buying up an awful lot of goods. As you buy up goods, now, mind you, people know that you have more money, and they're going to charge you more for this, because it's a demand concept. They once again, they only can make so many per day, and they know that you're bringing in more money, so prices start to go up. Not only that, but as you spend the money, the money starts to kind of filter through to people, and they collect more money and more money. Eventually it kind of filters through, but it never really reaches all the way to the very poorest people. And so there's always some disparity between rich and poor. Okay, there's always some. It just depends on how drastic the degree gets. The merchant, though, obviously becomes very wealthy because he's spent the money, he's done the resources, he's had to protect it, he's had to ship it back, and use his ships to do so. And so he invests an awful lot of time into doing these kinds of things, and you never really know how much you're going to be able to bring back and whether it's going to be worthwhile or not, but he has first dibs on this. Now, when it's introduced to the system, obviously there's more gold in the system, so that's part of the reason why the prices are starting to go up, because more people have more money and they're able to pay more in a whole barter system type concept. And that's an easy way to understand why prices go up as you inflate the money supply. Because if you've ever done an eBay auction, or you've ever encountered a barter type system where you actually have to barter prices, that's where it comes from. And that's one of the reasons why prices go up, is because as people have more money, then they're able to pay more, they're able to bid more, they're able to compete with other demanders for a certain limited supply of products. We've kind of lost that entire concept when we go into the store and they've already set prices. They know what they've put into it and what they spent, and they send it out to the market to see if people are willing to pay that or not. People don't even think about that concept. They're just look at it and like, yeah, I can pay that, or yeah, no, I can't. And so it's a little bit different, but that's where the concepts originate from. Now, if you look at the government side of things and the amount of money that is in the populace, the more money that's introduced, the more the government wants to take. So it starts to raise taxes. Once it starts to raise taxes, the effect is always the same. People want to move out; they don't want to be there. Merchants no longer want to come. They don't want to bring their stuff there anymore because they have to pay more than it's worth for them to sell their stuff. If you take enough from the people and the merchants are leaving and their jobs are leaving, well, the people can't stay because they're not able to pay the inflated taxes and they start leaving. Well, government oftentimes tries to raise more and tries to even take more from the people. Now, it's interesting to note this entire time that government does bare minimum for what it collects and what it takes in. And this is another concept that people probably don't pay much attention to. But you're out there as a miner, farmer, maybe you make shoes, cobbler, stonemason, whatever it is that your job is, and you're doing hard, actual physical labor, and you're exchanging that for gold for right now. And somebody else has had to go out, and the gold wasn't just there. Somebody has had to go out, retrieve it, mine it, smelt it, mint it, and protect it. A lot of work and labor has gone into that. So you're looking at actual exchanges of blood, sweat, and tears for blood, sweat, and tears. Now, government doesn't do anything. And I'm using government loosely because it could also be monarchies, but basically it's by force. And they're your quote-unquote protectors, and you're basically paying for that protection. And that's the idea generally for government, is somewhere in there that they're there to protect your property rights, and or at least your right to try to get more money, and you don't have to worry about other people coming along and stealing your stuff. But because government has a strength, they know that they can force you to pay more, and there's very little that you can do, and that's what happens. But your labor, your blood, your sweat, your tears, even the blood, sweat, and tears, the people who've brought that money, the gold, in, is being taken by people who don't put any blood, sweat, and tears into it at all. They just simply take it, and then they turn around and spend it. Now, you could also consider that government spending, and we could go further into that. In this case, if government took that money from the people and turned around and spent it right back into the populace, that government spending would actually spur on your economy. It's really not the same with deficit spending, because there's not labor that went into the actual origination of that currency and that money. But you're still taught that concept exists. It's a real fine line when you're dealing between fiat and asset currencies, and I think the concept should always exist of what actually went into get that money supply, and that's a really big thing. But anyway, so governments go along and they're collecting money, and greed is a crazy thing in governments. They always want more and more and more. And eventually they find out that they're spending money, and if you're a student of history at all, you always find out that the monarchies spend more than they have. The lavish lifestyles and the competitions that go into it, not to mention that they have to pay all of those armies that are supposed to be protecting the people and their property in the city or the area that they're in. Somebody has to pay those people because they're not doing anything else. They don't have two jobs. Their whole thing is just to protect the people. At some point in time, interestingly enough, when enough money is being spent by the government, the that protection is actually ended up being paid to protect the people in the government themselves, because it's often recognized that the people are being stripped of the labor that they're expending for somebody who's not expending any labor, and they're paying for their lifestyle, they're paying for their luxuries, they're paying for how they live. Now that part is exactly what happens, and nobody really seems to piece that together. All of those people that you represent, that you elect to a government in our system, you're paying for everything that they're doing. When they give themselves a raise, you're paying for those raises. You're paying for their full pensions as soon as they get elected. You're paying for a second elevated type of a secondary tier of medical insurance and medical health care. You're paying for their private jet flights everywhere. All of this stuff you're paying for, but that concept seems to escape people. I don't understand how it was allowed to get to the point where those roles of government used to be just simply a part-time gig where you got together, figured out what needed to be done in your areas, and then it all of a sudden turned into a full-time gig, and screwing the people over out of all of their money. But nonetheless, let's roll back to the example. So if you're that monarch or whatever, eventually the people get really mad that you're doing whatever it is you're doing, and you're paying the guards really to keep the people in line and to force them to give you more money. And like I said, people will leave if they can, or try to go somewhere else that maybe isn't so bad. But unfortunately, it seems that a lot of these monarchs, government entities, or whatever councils of government that control the power and the strength, that's what they always tend to do. They always go overboard with it. The cost sometimes gets more than what they can bear. So what happens is that you go back to that whole thing about, oh, well, we need resources, we need more gold, we need to take somebody else's resources, whatever it is. And then sometimes it's just simply because if you can start up a war, you can eliminate some of the population that might actually work to overthrow you. And so the wars end up being beneficial for these governments. And that's exactly what happens through history. You can see it happen over and over again. Then the end concept is that the person who's in charge of the governmental structure, or that strength or whatever, is usually the one pushing for that conquering force to take other resources, or take over another town or city or whatever, and then add to what it is that they have. Now, when all of this stuff is going on, interestingly enough, banking systems kind of developed from all of this, because of the fact that when you're in commerce, you're going to accumulate things, and in this instance, you're accumulating gold. And remember, like I said, gold doesn't go bad, so you can save it. Well, if you're a merchant, usually at some point in time, you may actually have to pay for your own security, because people know that you're going to have gold. If you don't carry it on you, then obviously it's at your house, and so people are going to know that gold is stashed at your house. And this isn't just for merchants, it's for everybody. Somebody had to have some kind of stuff stashed somewhere, because they always had to have it on their person. So it's not a far jump to think that someone somewhere would say, hey, you know what? I need to find somebody who can hold my accumulated gold so that I can do what I need to do, and not have these issues where I have to keep worrying about if somebody's going to take it. One of the places that was first to do this was your temples, and then secondary, your actual goldsmiths who may have done the minting. The reason why is because they already had a lot of the necessary business attributes, or business equipment, business resources to do this. If you're the temple, people are already donating money to you anyway, and so you've got people there probably 24 hours a day, and you probably have vaults already available. And it's a similar concept with the goldsmiths, because if they know the goldsmiths are doing and minting a lot of the gold, then they've already obviously got safes, and they probably got guards and everything as well. Once people realized that they already had these necessary pieces for this for this business, this business model was probably quick to catch on. You knew that you didn't really need to have a capital investment of very much. You needed some safes, and you needed to pay a couple of guards, and you could charge people fees for holding their money, holding their gold. And so banks would have originated from this. And sure enough, they did. But what happened is these places saw these people put all this money in. And if you think about it, you probably have, well, not everybody, but you probably have a certain amount of money that you never really like to go below in your account. If you think about your checking account or savings account or something like that, maybe you have $200, you never want to go below that or whatever. But there's always a certain amount of money that you'll keep in there and you won't want to go. Well, they noticed this in the gold supplies. They noticed that people would put in their pile of gold, but that would never go out. They'd never really come back for that. And you wouldn't unless you came back to do some kind of a major investment. What happened was these places that were holding it decided that, once again, greed, they would take the gold and they would begin lending it out without letting other people know that they were lending out their gold. And then on top of that, they would charge interest for those loans that were going out. Now, it might have been different if they let the people know and they offered to share some of the interest with the people when they were doing that. But they didn't. They just took it and lent it out. Well, it wasn't long before somebody came in to retrieve a big chunk of gold for some kind of an investment, and they said they didn't have it. They miscalculated the amount that they were going to need on hand to keep this ruse going, and then you have your first bank runs. And actually that happens an awful lot over the course of history. You could find all kinds of stuff, but oftentimes when that happens, government has to step in because somebody's got to control the peace and figure out a way for this whole thing to work. What they ended up coming up with was more of a receipt system. And this whole receipt system, I should probably take a step back. Some of the biggest lenders to take that money always ended up being the government or the monarchy. They always wanted more money. They wanted more expenditures. They always figured they could tax the people more, and so they actually took a lot of the gold that would come out of these whether it be banks, temples, or goldsmiths. I just call them financial institutions, but government took the money, and like the monarchies, I don't think you have to look too far for an example. You could look at Versailles and how much was spent on that. I think, what was that, Louis I don't know, there was a lot of Louis. Could have been the 14th, but anyway, Versailles was one of those great expenditures of opulence that the aristocrats threw money away on. Anyway, government would have definitely been persuaded to keep the peace if they were the ones taking most of that money. And unfortunately, the people who put it in there when those runs occurred probably just ended up losing out on that. So kind of a coordinated effort, but the financial institutions didn't really want to have bank runs or have people come and get them. And obviously the governments didn't really want to have people come and get them. So they come up with more of a receipt system, and you deposit your gold and they write you out your receipts and certificates, and they actually more or less just back those receipts as representative of the gold that was available in the banks. The receipts ended up being traded just as much as any of the gold would, and it was easier to do the receipts. So the receipts ended up actually holding kind of that mental value of whatever was printed on those things. And so by doing that, the financial institutions kind of went around the same underhanded dealings, because now all they had to do is write out a certificate that guaranteed that such and such was backed by a certain amount of gold. And somebody could go and trade that, because these were becoming just as well accepted as the gold was. Not everywhere, obviously. It's the same thing if you ran in and you and now today, and somebody says cash only as opposed to having your credit card. I mean, to you it may be the same thing, but to them it's not. Well, same thing. Not everybody was going to take these receipts, but a number of people did, and it definitely became more prevalent. But what they were able to do is write out receipts or certificates that were backed by a certain amount of gold, and people were able to go out and use this, even if they were doing this above and beyond, once again, of the amount of gold they had in there backing them. The difference, though, is that if somebody came in to get their gold, well, they had all of the gold there. And they were just kind of making bets that not everybody would come in at one time to get the gold. And for the most part, that was true. As long as you could maintain a perception of stability in and amongst the populace, then nobody would come and do bank runs. But it's also the reason why people were basically put down by force when they would do bank runs, because then people would find out that they had been doing this again. And this happens through history as well. You can definitely go through and see these kinds of things. I do want to backtrack just a little bit and talk about gold and its use, the inflation or debasement of gold and that concept, before I get into a little bit more of the receipts and where that would extend to. But if you've ever heard of economists or financial analysts or strategists talking about Rome and the debasement of the currency, that maybe you heard that there was less and less gold or whatever in the coins that they would go along. I've always found that concept a little bit fascinating, but maybe for different reasons than what other people would figure. Because one of the things about having an asset currency is that you can't spend more than you have stockpiled and readily available for you. There is no credit system on this stuff. I mean, unless somebody's willing to extend you credit, which most of the time you wouldn't extend credit, because there's so much risk involved in exchanging assets for assets. For example, if somebody said that they would, could you extend them, 4 bags of flour and, some 2x4s, and they'll come back and they'll get you, next time. And maybe their trade is, like I said, fishing, but fishing's been bad, so they haven't had the money or they haven't had the catches, and they haven't had enough fish to really make a profit to pay you back. But there's the risk of not only not being able to catch the fish, but there's also the risk of all of a sudden maybe that fish doesn't become desirable in the marketplace. And so there's multiple risks involved in an asset-to-asset switch where you don't really extend credit. You only get to trade what you have, and like I said, it's based upon the person's perception of what you're holding and how valuable that is to them. And so there's a lot of risk that goes into that sort of a system, but it also holds everything relatively stable and true, because unless there's a huge shift in, like I said, the perception of fish or a type of lumber or whatever becomes trendy, for the most part, people are only going to use exactly what they've always been using. It's a pretty stable system, and you can actually look at commodities and grains and foods and see that for the most part, year over year, the usage of corn and soy or wheat or what have you is all pretty stable. It doesn't change by that much, unless something becomes trendy. But even then, on a huge scale, it doesn't create that much of a blip. So the concept of that, having that asset-backed currency, means that you can only spend what you have. So what ends up happening, like I said, governments want to spend more and more. If you haven't jumped to the paper part and you're still minting currencies like they would have done in the Roman Empire, perhaps you're minting coins, but you run into issues when you have to mint coins. If you're minting 1 ounce coins, but something is only worth half an ounce, you have to have half-ounce denominations. It's the same concept of if you're going to trade, say, 6 goats for 1 cow. Perhaps that's what you work out in a barter trade, but you don't really want to trade 6 goats. You only want to trade 3 goats for something, and maybe you want a smaller cow. It's like a denomination kind of thing. Can I get a smaller cow for that, or maybe an older cow, or whatever. It's the same thing. Perhaps that cow is worth one ounce of a gold coin, but you only have maybe half an ounce or something like that. I mean, you need breakoffs, you need denominations, and not just denominations really in gold. It's actually weight, which is probably more convenient. And maybe it's only worth a half an ounce or a quarter ounce or whatever. That's all you have. So you have to work out some kind of a system. But if you're a government and you want transactions in commerce to occur other than the barter system, because it makes it much easier for you to collect taxes, well, you have to supply that currency. You have to mint it. And you only can mint that which you have. And so there's a lot that goes into that. You want people to use your coins and currencies. It's probably an ego thing, as opposed to just simply gold. Because if they're just using regular old gold, you probably haven't gotten to tax it. It's a pretty simple thing. But anyway, you're having to do different types, which is why you also ended up with a dual currency system, gold and silver. And silver being worth a certain amount to gold. But all kinds of crazy stuff gets mixed into that when you talk about consumer demand for one metal over another metal, and that plays in an entire different role. It's very difficult to make predictions when you're dealing with some of this kinds of stuff. But empires grow. Like I said, they're paying for all kinds of different stuff because the people expect, and if the people don't get it, they're probably going to riot. You can only pay soldiers so much money that you have available to actually protect you from these riots, which is why Rome developed a lot of this bread and circuses and games. So eventually what they tried to do was they tried to kind of cheat the people. They thought that the people valued the Roman coins because they could be spent anywhere in the empire. They would mix the gold with other kinds of alloys. Say it's, I don't know, maybe it was gold and copper or something like that, but maybe you get half an ounce in an original 1 ounce gold coin. Maybe you then have a half an ounce of copper, half an ounce of gold. Okay, it's still the same coin, it's still worth the same, but it's now half and half. Or maybe it's 3/4 of an ounce of copper and 1/4 ounce of gold, or whatever. And that it really, however much money you need to disperse throughout the empire for whatever was going on and whatever expenditures you're doing. Like I said, if you weren't bringing in any more gold, no other commerce or trade was going on, you ran out of a gold supply and people to tax and money to take, and your expenditures are way more than what you're bringing in, you're going to run into this problem. So that's what they start doing, is they start creating currency that doesn't have as much gold. Well, then people looked at it and said, oh, well, there's more money circulating. That's why inflation, it's an inflation of the money supply, and that's why prices were going up. But it wasn't. And it's because of the fact that people valued the items in gold, not the currency that was being exchanged. For example, you go back to that cow. If we've now gotten the currency down to 3/4 of copper and a 1/4 ounce of gold for each one of those coins, that used to be that 1 ounce coin or whatever for a cow. Well, the person who's selling the cow doesn't want that one coin, even though that coin is technically denominated in the same amount. The person wants what's in it. They want the gold that's in it. They want 4 coins. That cow is now 4 coins instead of 1 coin. They didn't really give a patoot about whether it was stamped by the Roman Empire or not. They want the gold. And that's where it came in. It still was 1 ounce of gold. That the price of the cow did not change in terms of gold. It was 1 ounce of gold, which was 4 coins instead of the 1 coin. So the price went up because there was more money printed, but it wasn't because of the money printing that was actually the concept. It was because in terms of asset pricings, gold tends to stabilize the price. Things that were priced out in an ounce of gold 200-300 years ago are still probably an ounce of gold today, or very, very close. It's interesting to look at that. I think somebody had said that an ounce of gold, which was say $35 way back in, I forget, 1920s or something. Time frame's a little bit different, but say with that $35, you were able to get brand new pair of shoes and suit and a couple shirts and a tie or whatever. Well, today that $2,000, you could probably still get something comparable to that today, because that 1 ounce of gold is where it's priced in at, and that's where gold's pricings maintain. It's very stable for what it is, and so that concept was the same, even though the money that was going out and being dispersed was debased. And I don't even really know. I mean, yes, the money supply was inflated, but here's another thing that people don't generally understand the concept too. All right, so inflation isn't necessarily a bad thing. What happened is that the Fed changed the definition for inflation and deflation, which was just convenient for them. Inflation and deflation is just simply either the expansion or the contraction of the total available supply of money, and that's the real definition, the way it should be viewed, because then you're just simply talking about how much money is available, and that is direct relation to pricings, but it in and of itself, if a price goes up, is not inflation. That's not what inflation is. The price of something that goes up is maybe a result of inflation, but it may also not be a result of inflation. See, it takes away the concept of supply and demand when you use that alternative definition. If you were looking once again at the Roman Empire, the empire is expanding. They need to spend more money. Like I said, they only can spend the amount of gold that they have on hand, and you need several denominations of this gold, at least from their perspective, to make transactions happen. Well, eventually you just have to keep printing money, because there are so many people out there using money that they all need something to use for exchange. If you don't have a physical currency to exchange, how else to exchange things? You have to go to bartering. Well, I mean, that's, once again, it's a very difficult thing to kind of manage if you have to go back to bartering. Nobody really takes into consideration the fact that if you had to make all of your transactions in cash and everybody had to just use cash, cash wears down, cash goes bad, cash has to be replaced. The more people that are out and about doing things, more cash has to be made. So you can have money in your pocket, money in the bank, money to take out. The physical representation of that currency, that medium, has to be available, and it's no real different. So you need to have some kind of inflation to keep up with just simply the number of people who are going to spend, the number of transactions and what those transactions represent, which is why it's important to keep those definitions separate, because there does need to be some kind of inflation. And so for the total number of transactions that are taking place, you need to have you need to have the cash available and the coinage available to do the transactions. And the more people that are around, then the more coinage you need. And so you need to have some kind of inflation that goes along with it. If the money supply is going and is increasing, is inflating at the same rate of the number of people who are available to do transactions, then that inflation is going to even out. It's going to thin out over the number of people, and you're not going to see a price increase. The only way you're going to see a price increase is if money supply goes above and beyond the rate of increase of the number of people, the number of transactions that are actually occurring. Like if you have, to keep it simply, say you have 5 people in a room, each person makes say $5 a day, and so they're going to go around and they're going to bid on goods. And so they're going to use that $5 for the day to go and bid on certain things. Obviously, it goes back to what they're going to pay for goods is going to be related to how beneficial that good is to them, and then obviously how much money they have. And then they're going to try to go and pay for these items. Food would be high on that list, water would be high on the list, and so on. Well, what happens is that the people who are providing those goods to them, they all know that that's what they've got for money. They can't charge way more than what these people have if they actually want to sell them. But once again, it's kind of a concept of somewhere in there it's gonna be the concept of how many they have available to sell and how many they're able to make in a given day. So you find your medium, and it's only if their item again is of value to these other people that it actually counts. But now say these 5 people, there's more money printed or there's credit allowed or whatever. Now they all have $10 a day. Well, the prices that are going to go aren't going to hold the same. I mean, these people now have $10 to spend, and the people who are supplying the goods know that these people have $10 to spend. And it doesn't always have to be knowingly. Eventually, you can see that people are able to spend more money, and their goods are going away faster. So that means demand is increasing, supply is decreasing, and so then the prices are going to slowly go up. And eventually they're going to even out. It's just how it works. You don't even have to consciously know it. You can just see that more of your goods are disappearing faster. Like, well, what the heck is going on? I'm not really making that much more money, but everybody else seems to be doing a lot better. Well, I'm going to increase my prices if this many more people can buy them. Maybe if only 2 of the 5 wanted to buy an item at first, but now all of a sudden 4 of the 5, well, holy moly, okay, so I get 4 of the 5 at this price, but if I was doing fine at 2 and whatever they were spending then, I can raise the price. Where am I at now? And that concept exists, obviously also from the perspective of the person making it, what they can get with the money that they're looking to gain from their products they sell to buy other things for themselves. So that therein is a representation that if the same number of people and the money increases or inflates, then obviously prices are going to go up. But now the total amount of money that was available there was 5 times 10 was 50. The first place it was 5 times 5, which was 25. So see, now you have 10 people and they all have $5, just like they did the first. Now the total amount available is 50, so it's been inflated, the total money supply, but it's now spread amongst more people. While they're still all at $5, they're still all only able to spend a certain amount on the given goods. Now the prices might bump a little bit because there might be more people and a limited number of supply of goods, but they're not going to bump as much as they did when there was a huge jump in inflation for a smaller number of people. And hopefully that kind of makes a little bit of sense, but that happens in a marketplace, and that's exactly how it kind of plays out, and why it's important to understand concepts of how inflation actually would affect prices. Not that prices going up is inflation. That's not what it is. And once again, you can go back to that example of the coin debasement. It's the same kind of concept. More coins are needed, but less gold is in each coin. Well, I mean, prices go up, but not because more coins were printed. Coins went up because of the fact that gold stabilizes prices, and I think that's kind of I think that's a better way to look at it, because people just kind of gloss over that and they don't look at the fact that people wanted what was valuable. They didn't want the currency, the coin. They want what it can buy, and they want what it represents. That's actually kind of the same thing with the dollar, and why it's important to understand that it's not the dollar that buys you stuff. It's the faith that people have that it can buy you stuff that makes it desirable. That's why they say the full faith and credit. Well, I don't really know how much that's going to be worth anymore, but nonetheless, now that I've kind of said my bit on the gold thing, so if we roll back to the receipts, the receipts eventually get, they're being traded, and it's not all unlike that currency, and the system itself actually backs it very similar to how the dollar was gold backed up until 1971. But that whole debasement thing, remember I was telling you about the coin, and there's less and less gold in the coin. It actually works in a similar concept when you have a gold-backed currency that's a paper currency. So these receipts, they're trading the receipts for the gold that's stored in the different financial institutions. So if you want to start switching over to paper, And you don't want to keep minting your gold, kind of like I said. At some point in time, you have to find a way to do a denomination or a minting that's represented by gold in a vault. And so this whole trading of receipts kind of gives the idea to start doing gold certificates and silver certificates as a medium of exchange by the government and a printing press. So the government decides that that's what it's going to do, is it's going to start having money that its people can spend. Of course, once you get large enough as a government, once you become kind of a sovereign nation or a country, you obviously can do these kinds of things. It's if you keep growing your monarchy, your town, your city, whatever, again, your tribe, whatever, if it keeps taking over more territory, more regions, more people, and you become an empire or just a country or a nation state or whatever it is, you will eventually be able to mint coin or print money or whatever, just like what happened with Rome. Obviously, technology plays a big factor in what you're able to do with the money supply. Rome only was able to smelt metals and print coins. Now we obviously are able to do paper, and not only paper, but different types of paper and notes, and it's a continual fight to try to prevent counterfeits of this, but that would be the next progression, and that's where these receipts and these golds kind of stem the idea. And you can actually look more into this. The first folks who originated this concept were the Knights Templar. They started the first concepts of a banking system and actually ATMs. They would hold people's gold in one city and write out a receipt or a certificate, and they would stamp their seal or their logo or whatever on it, and that person could bring that, say, from London into Paris, or Paris into Rome, or Rome into Jerusalem, and wherever they were at, they could present that certificate and draw out the amount of gold that it said on there. And that is kind of an interesting little tidbit. Of course, it's probably the ability, or that financial logistics and that system that they developed that made them a very powerful and extremely wealthy group, and why they were a primary target back in the 1300s. And I mean, you can look that up, but anyway, I think it's an interesting tidbit that they were the ones who kind of first used the receipts and the certificates on a broad range to develop an ATM type system and a functional system of banking that was not just in a city or a nation, but over a continent, actually. Anyway, once the government has the idea to actually just print money and it can just hold the gold, the people still, same concept. They know that they're holding a certain amount of money, and they're only going to come in and draw a certain amount of money. Probably everybody's not going to come draw it at the same time, and if they do, they just prevent them from doing so. And once again, it's encouraging people to spend a little bit more than what they have. But at the same time, when you start using this money, and governments will start to transact globally or with other countries, with other nations, and if they transact in their currency, then those countries are going to want to exchange that currency for actual gold. And these transactions actually occur. Like, they'll accumulate a certain amount, and they'll come back and they'll say, well, I've got all this, I'd like the gold. And sure enough, then you'd have to do a gold transaction. And this actually happened in the banking systems too. If you were drawing checks from one banking institution to another, you would collect all those checks, and that banking institution would go to that one and say, here's all these checks, I need to gather all this money from you so I can bring it back to my bank. The evolution of the financial system is quite a read when you look into it. But the whole idea is that at some point in time, the government it's still stuck with a certain pile of gold that it has. If it prints more money or puts out more certificates, and people who take these are going to want to audit it, mostly other countries, and they're going to want to know that you have the gold on hand, and you're going to have to give that gold over to these other countries once you do exchange. And the other countries claim that gold, and it shifts over, and it keeps everybody pretty much stable. I mean, you can only trade for what you have available because somebody else is going to come to claim it. This proves to be a problem for governments that want to keep expanding and keep spending more, because when you start to develop a whole lot of countries, there's no more territory, no more land and such really for people to go and take. The resources are being claimed by other places that are just as strong as you are. And once you kind of have this stalemate, then it comes into the marketplaces, what you develop. And this is where the real concepts of macroeconomics get to be really kind of fun. And you get to look at the driving factors of global trade and specializations and things of that nature. But for right now, just kind of look at the government doing this, and how that they would benefit if they can separate from this. The problem is that if you separate from this, then the money that you're giving over to another country is just paper. It's not backed by anything. Who wants to take something that's not backed by anything? But the benefit for the government is that if you're able to just print paper, then you can print as much as you really want. If you can get away with the negative effects of inflation. And so how do you combat these kinds of things? And it wasn't just the governments who came up with this, because the financial institutions want to break away from this as well. Remember, if they're able to loan out other people's gold without them knowing, then they can collect more interest on these things. They don't just need the fees, they can get interest and loan out other people's stuff. But if they're no longer beholden to just the money that they have in their vaults, they can make even more money by loaning out money that they don't have. And once again, both of these entities, if you see any kind of commonality here, are getting paid they're getting paid a heck of a lot more than what the work is that they're actually doing. And they're getting paid for basically printing stuff out of thin air, and it's being compensated by actual real work and labor and real commerce transactions that other people are doing. And so that's wherein the whole thievery of the system and the whole serfdom attitude comes into play. But if you're a banking system and you can get away with this, then you can become extremely wealthy. Because remember what else I said. If you were to find a mine of gold, wherever that gold first originates from, in that case it was the merchant, remember, then that merchant benefits most from being able to buy up a whole bunch of stuff before all of that money flows through the entire city, town, or whatever, and kind of gets into the system. And then everybody has more money, and the kind of prices will go up because limited number of people, inflated supply of money, prices will rise a little bit. But because the merchant had it first, he's going to benefit before the prices react, because prices are always going to be a little bit sticky. They're not going to react as quickly. Same concept with these banks and the government. If somebody else is able to just print the money, the first people who get a hold of that money are going to benefit most before it actually gets through the entire supply of the people. Now, you have to figure out a way to do this. The only real way to do this is to get other places to take your money. And that's the real hard part about it. And that's what was drawn up in the financial system that we actually have today, and where they kind of stole it from. If you look back into the Fed Reserve in 1913, it was developed by two representatives, both of whom came from families that were in the newspaper business. So it's nothing like having working propaganda for whatever you're doing. One of them was a familial relative of the Rothschild family, so that's not a conspiracy theory. That's That's actually a fact. If you read anything up on any of the Fed reserves and central banking system, they'll tell you that basically they were a savior for the country, and that without them, nothing would have ever happened, and all kinds of catastrophes occurred along the way, which isn't really true, because if you look at the historical context of what was going on when bank runs and so on happened, a lot of it was either growth of the nation type stuff, or it was something that was actually caused, the whole cause and effects thing, by the actual government entities themselves. And then, of course, they present the solution. How else do you push in a banking system that isn't really well liked or wanted? And this happens all the time. If you're ever against something and a huge tragedy happens to force it through, it's probably government that did it. So the Federal Reserve was instituted in 1913. If you want to read up more on that, you can. The Creature from Jekyll Island is a really fantastic book. It's thick, and I know it looks intimidating, but it's pretty simple to understand. By the time they got to, I don't know, third or fourth edition, it was really well written, actually fairly entertaining the way it was written, and it even gives beginning chapter, post chapter, quick recaps, so you don't necessarily even have to read entire chapters. You can get quick tidbits on those chapters without having to go through all of them, and that's for every chapter in the book. It's a very informative book, but if you go through it, bear in mind you're probably going to be really upset at what was happened and what was pushed through by a government that didn't have to care, because if you're joined at the hip with the financial system, then you're going to be the benefactor of whatever financial system gets pushed through. And so that's kind of what happened there. But worse, they actually convinced the government to pay them money to print the currencies for the country. So remember I told you that you have to keep printing money as a country grows and then populace grows. Well, every time you print something, you get paid for that. Plus you get money on top of that, because each thing that's printed also has a certain amount of interest involved in it. And so these bankers and these financial institutions were making money hand over fist. On top of that, they controlled the entire banking structure for the country. And as the money was printed and sent to the banks and the financial institutions, remember, they're the first ones to hold on to it. So they make out like bandits, because they're the ones who lease or loan out this money to other entities, and then charge interest on that, and they make fees from this. But remember, they didn't do anything to get this money. They're just where it's originating from, and where money originates from, they're the ones who benefit from it first. What's even crazier is that they get to do fractional reserve banking, and so whatever they have that they hold on hand, say if you're depositing stuff, they get to loan out multiples more of what they have on hand. It's not any different than what I was telling you about the institutions that held the gold on hand and decided that, well, you know what, we're just going to write out these receipts and we're going to give these to people and we're going to charge them for it because we've got this gold on hand and nobody's going to come and claim it. Well, it's just, the fractional reserve system is exactly that. The only difference is that your money that you put in isn't gold anymore because they removed that. It's just your money, but it still represents your labor and it represents your time, resources, and everything else that went into it. The entire system is set up so that the printing is allowed to go above and beyond what is actually on hand, and was released from the gold-backed system in 1971. They actually confiscated the gold in 1933, or made an attempt to. I don't know. It's a fairly depressing system, but to understand the concept of what happens with it, the whole idea of breaking away from an asset-backed currency system. Remember, I said that it's just paper. Somebody else has to take it. But in order for somebody to take your currency, you kind of have to force them to do so. If it's another country, you just find a way to force them. And so the OPEC agreement, or OPEC, was put together, and that was right there in the 70s when we were going through all that really massive, crazy inflation. Of course, that's because it broke away from the gold-backed currency, and people didn't really know whether there was going to be any value or any retrievable value to the U.S. dollars, because the only thing other countries could use dollars for is just to buy goods from, the U.S., whatever the U.S. was exporting. And so it took a while for the OPEC to kick in. Eventually, it would be that wars and the instituting of central banks in all these different countries would force people to transact in the world reserve currency, and the demand for this currency would thin out the amount of inflation and spending. And it was necessary to do that, because if you spend way beyond what you have as a government, then it's an inflated money supply. Once again, it's inflation. It's inflating the money supply. And remember what I said: if the number of transactions of the populace stays the same, an inflated money supply will have the prices take off. But if you thin that out over a whole lot of transactions across the world, you don't really see that same thing. Not only that, but you get to spend more and more and more for however far out and however much you can thin that out across populaces and transactions throughout the world. And so that's where you get this huge deficit spending. And that's really all it is when they say that they're going to be deficit spending, and somebody else comes in and buys our debt. They're just basically buying up what would be that inflation. They're buying up those dollars and holding those dollars because they're going to need them anyway. They're forced to use them. The whole thing with the treasuries, though, is that they're paid out on an interest rate. And I don't really know, but it used to be that the interest rates were representative of the amount of risk of whether you'd be able to be paid back or not. But once you're able to kind of suppress those interest rates, I don't really know how much it matters anymore. I mean, shoot, we're looking at negative interest rates in a lot of places. How does that even make sense in a world of banking? But primarily going back to the blood, sweat, and tears part of paying back on things that are just simply printed, I want to just kind of to throw out a concept here of, if you go in and you get a loan, and say it's $1,000 a loan, and by the time you're done paying it back, you owe $100 worth of interest. Okay, so you're getting that loan. Now, mind you, the bank didn't have to do anything to get this money. They get to take whatever's been deposited, and they can loan out, say, 10 times what they have deposited. So they just made the money out of thin air. They didn't have to do anything. It doesn't represent anything. It doesn't represent even other people's labor who agreed to loan money out to other people. It doesn't represent anything. They're going to make money off this money that came out of thin air. But you, on the other hand, are going to take this $1,000, and you're going to have to go out and buy resources to create a product that hopefully is going to be able to have value. And you're going to pay back that $1,000 that balances out their books or whatever that they've got on the books. Now, the $100 in interest, you have to do even more labor. But that labor, once again, is going to pay, because those fees, that interest pays the infrastructure and salaries for that financial institution. So you're there and then paying to keep those people employed doing whatever it is that they're doing, printing money out of thin air and not putting any real work or effort into it. What's worse is that money that they printed out of thin air, if you owe them that money, they can then confiscate real tangible assets for money that's never been represented by anything but paper on a printing press. Now, it would be different if you were using gold, because gold actually represents actual capital investment to retrieve it. And that capital investment, gold can always be traded for something else. Somebody else can always find a use for gold. the paper dollars that you end up with, you can't trade that for anything unless it's on the faith and credit of someone who thinks that they can exchange it for something else. But the paper in and of itself isn't really worth anything. It's just a concept to consider. Now, that's not to say that banks and financial institutions don't have uses, because they do. They now, that's not to say that banks and financial institutions don't have use, because they do. Obviously, it's exactly what I said. I mean, you need to have someplace to store your money, otherwise you're bound to be robbed of it. My entire point is that you shouldn't be allowed to create money that doesn't exist, because there's nothing attached to it. And if you're going to swap like for like, there has to be some kind of an attachment to it. But even if you were going to loan out that gold, if you let people know that you were going to loan their gold and they made a conscious decision to allow that, and then you got a cut of the interest rates, I mean, that wouldn't really be all that much different from investing or buying stocks in companies. And it's a similar kind of concepts, and that's another niche that financial institutions fill. They can create marketplaces and pool a whole lot of cash, and they can do a lot of the groundwork and information gathering from that perspective to do that kind of stuff, and that would be fine to make fees from. But when you start printing and doing deficit printing from nothing, then you're just simply stealing the actual labor and resources that other people have actually put time into. I mean, if you just take it from a kind of a real loose neighborhood perspective, if you had a gang or whatever come into a neighborhood and said, we're gonna all transact in this currency here, and we're gonna print it. And they start printing it, and they distribute it, and they're able to control it, but they're also able to use it to buy stuff. It's not going to really be too long before the people aren't really going to want to take that, unless they're forced to take it, because they can print it and buy up whatever they want and everything they want, but there's nothing associated to it. So people are literally just working for them for free. It's kind of this whole mirage that commerce or physical transactions taking place, but it's not. If they're printing it for free and they're buying a car from you, well, the people who made that car for free for that person. It didn't cost them anything. And you sold that, and you transacted it, and you did all of the paperwork on that car to sell it to that person for nothing, because they printed the money on a press. You're literally doing work for somebody else for nothing. It's an imaginary transaction that takes place. Numbers change, but these numbers don't mean anything because they were created from nothing. The numbers are kind of this illusion that something has taken place and some kind of monetary transaction has been enacted, but it's not. It's no different than just simply working for them for free. I mean, in essence, that's why I say it's a slave system. It's a serfdom system, because then they're able to give you money for free. It doesn't cost them anything. But if you're not able to pay back that money that came from nothing, they can take your stuff. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense and you can see that, but that's where it all comes from. That's where it originates. And I know these are always long when I do these. I don't know if you get anything out of them, or if anybody cares to listen to them. I don't know. There's not a lot of attention spans today, but anyway, that's my bit on that. And I know it was circled around a lot of stuff, but if you can't really talk financial institutions if you don't talk government and where it came from and the concepts of assets and deficit spending. I mean, there's the big thing. One is really associated and tied to real blood, sweat, and tears. The other's a slavery system where you're doing work for somebody else who's done nothing. That's really the recap. But anyway, thank you for listening.